The following podcast is brought to you by the Johners Podcasting Network, found exclusively at wrestlingwithjohners.com. And so I'm intrigued to know, so you've left Butlins, you're no longer a Redcoat, working on a regular basis for All Star and Brian Dixon. What was your schedule like back then? Because I know them being one of the biggest touring brands of the UK, of British wrestling history, probably the biggest touring brand. But what was your schedule like back then, certainly in wrestling?
I was quite lucky being a southerner because at those times a lot of the cars came from the north. So you had the northern car, or a couple of northern cars arrive, and then a few of us southerners. But we used to have a date sheet where Brian would put all the dates that he wanted you to do on them. So you can imagine some of the big stars of the time that were very much in demand. You have Marty Jones and all the Ball Rockos, and I had a very full date sheet. Mine wasn't quite as long as that, but you'd look down it, and if you're lucky, they were all down the south. So Brian very rarely sent me any further north than the Midlands. So I wouldn't do Skegness or Newcastle or any. I was up to about the Midlands, up to Wolverhampton. So you will see there would be a Croydon and a Guildford and maybe a Norwich on there, but and occasionally, and you had the chance if you couldn't make it, you could tell him that you pull out. But I always used to get Plymouth and Portsmouth mixed up, and when I saw Portsmouth, I thought that's oh no, hang on, it says Plymouth. That was a long way to go. But I was lucky because being an MC, I wasn't as vital as the wrestlers that people saw on posters. So I got the southern shows, which were quite handy. And again, we had a northern car come, so it was all right. It wasn't too manic, but the days of the date sheet are fondly remembered.
Absolutely. And when I think of Lee Bamber, I think of Lee Bamber, the MC, Lee Bamber, the ring announcer, and of course you are a very skilled referee. You said you learned the skills as a young boy watching World of Sport on the TV, and then kind of actually did refereeing duties when you became a blue coat and so on. But what sort of ratio, what sort of split between doing MCing and refereeing would you experience on a regular basis? Because I say automatically put two and two together and came up with Lee Bamber, the ring announcer. But being a referee as well, did you do that regularly?
I mean, when I was younger, as we said earlier, I wanted to be a referee. That was the thing I wanted to be. I wasn't so much bothered about the MCing side. But Brian, in those days, again, just taking over from Dal Martin, there were quite a few referees around, but there weren't that many MCs that did it regularly. As we mentioned, John Harris and people like Gordon Pryor, who I'm still in touch with now, and you'll see a lot of Gordon's matches on World of Sport, and Paul Chalmers was another one from that era, but there weren't that many. And I think because I'd done radio as a DJ and stuff, I think Brian sort of saw me more as an MC, and that kind of just evolved. Whereas being a referee is what I want to do. I think the split was probably, I do about 8 MCing jobs to every refereeing job.
Right.
Back in that was but that was quite good because at the beginning I got to work with some of the refereeing heroes of mine as well, because a lot of them worked for Dal Martin and then stopped, but one or two came over and worked for Brian as well. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Peter Zakash. He was great fun. The brother of Tibor Zakash, who was a legendary wrestler of the 60s and 70s, and he was a very good referee, so he was one of my favorites. And I got to travel with him. He was a nightmare though, Peter, because he was Hungarian, he came from Budapest, and he would call everyone darling in that Hungarian tone of his, and he's a nice enough guy and great fun. He'd go, "Hello darling, how are you?" And that was lovely. But when I was new, and I was brand new to the business, and I'd gone up to Norwich at the Saturday night at the Corn Exchange, which is probably one of the dodgiest venues you could possibly do. in my dodgy car, and I noticed my light, one of the lights wasn't working. And Brian said, "Can you give Peter a lift back?" Now, I lived at a place called Sudbury Hill, which is near Harrow, around that way. Now, having to give Peter a lift back means going through London and down just outside Brixton. That's where he lived. So I've got this dodgy car. I've got Peter in the car. We go into Brixton. By then, on a Saturday night, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning with a light that doesn't work. So I got pulled over by the police. And I'm being to them, they're expecting some sort of trouble or whatever. I don't know, at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of London. So we got the usual, where have you been? Where do you come from? And they were quite shocked when I said Norwich. Why have you been to Norwich? We did wrestling. So, well, who are you then? He said, well, I'm the MC. This is, so I'm just a bit, being polite, like what I am. And then Peter pipes up, doesn't he? And and he says, "Can I swear?" By the way,
yes, go ahead.
Yeah. he said, "Oh, for God's sake, why don't you go and catch proper criminal, for fuck's sake?" And Peter, "No, you go catch proper criminal this time of night. It's we just travel. You bugger off." So he's telling policemen to bugger off, and I'm only about 20 or 18 in this knackered old car. I just about got away with it. So it almost turns nasty. But I mean, luckily, I think the police, accepted the story, because it seemed bizarre that we come from Norwich doing a wrestling show. But yes, I had to say, "Peter, shh, quiet." I had to tell one of my heroes to behave himself. Yes, but that was good fun.
I think you alluded to it earlier on, but let's talk about the TV deal then, because I believe when you started with All Star, they didn't have TV at first, and then maybe a year or so later, I think it was 87, they got the TV deal with ITV and with World of Sport. Now, does that sound about right to you?
Yes,
87,
that's right. Yes, it was.
87. Yeah. And I think the format had changed quite a bit, certainly over the previous year or two, because obviously wrestling had its 4 o'clock a segment time slot on World of Sport every Saturday. And I think by about 87, I think it was probably a show of its own. And I think it was being shuffled in the schedule on Saturdays or whatever day it would show. But it wasn't quite the same as it used to be. But how big of a deal was it to yourself and maybe Brian and All Star in general to have gained that TV deal back in 87? Because I think it was also shared, wasn't it? I think that Joint Promotions still had matches on there, and I think the American product started coming over and being shown as well. So I think it was maybe a bit of a three-way share between All Star, Joint Promotions, and WWF at the time. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, it was. I mean, it was a huge deal, because up until then, Joint Promotion, so in the later years, Max Crabtree had that was the Saturday afternoon was promoted by them. There were still promotions around the country, but they were the only ones that got into TV, made all the big stars, made all the stars on the poster. So they were guarding that, with their life. And it was, as you say, things were evolving. World of Sport had finished. I mean, because sometimes people will say, "Oh, you are a World of Sport MC." Technically, I'm not, because I didn't do it until World of Sport had finished. But you're right. Yeah, they moved it around the schedule. It was always on a Saturday, but they took it away from the 4 o'clock and put it on at 1 or 2 or whatever. But for someone else to be able to get a slice of that ITV contract, was big news. And Brian had done quite well with that, because by then I think Joint Promotion was seeing the beginning of the end, and all the big names that people had seen for the last 8, 9, 10 years had come over to Brian anyway. So you had your Nagasaki's, your Roccos, your Wayne Bridges, Johnny Saint, Steve Gray, Jimmy Breaks, all the big names that were still synonymous of your ITV World of Sport had come over to Brian. So Brian shows from 87 onwards were better than the ones that Joint Promotions were putting on. And as you said, then we had the taster of the American stuff as well. So it was an interesting time. Yeah,
it was indeed. Yes, and I think that it was around that time when I would visit my nan, my grandma, every Saturday. We would watch the World of Sport wrestling on Saturday afternoon. I think probably back to when it was 4 o'clock, and then I'd say it got shuffled around the schedule a little bit. But that was around the time when I first encountered wrestling, and American wrestling as well, because that was also slotted into that time slot on occasions. But let's talk about some of the bigger stars that you were working with at the time. You mentioned that quite a few of these came over from Dale Martin or joint promotions to All Star for a variety of reasons. But the likes of Johnny Saint, Rollerball Rocco, Tony St. Clair, Fit Finley, Danny Boy Collins, Steve Regal, Kendo, of course, and so many more. All of whom were household names even by this point. Give us an idea of what it was like to be around some of these icons of the sports nowadays, but big stars back then. What was it like to be around them, and how were they towards you?
Most of them were okay, because obviously I wouldn't impose myself too much on them. But again, because I thought I'd learned from John Harris how to introduce them, and you would always say, how do you want to be introduced? Because they might have something they want particularly said. Most of them weren't bothered, in fact, but you knew them anyway, because back then you could get in the ring and introduce Jimmy Breaks or someone. They were fine. I mean, you think of going into a dressing room with someone like Giant Haystacks, this big guy, but as is widely reported, everyone knows in the wrestling business, he really was a gentle giant, softly spoken, yeah. A lovely fella. So they were okay. I think they took me on okay. They didn't. Dave Findlay nicked my shoes when I first started, just before I went on, but that was more of an initiation ceremony for him. He hid them in the cupboard. But no, they were okay.
Awesome. And you mentioned Giant Haystacks and one or two other individuals. And I remember seeing Haystacks going back to the Oxford Town Hall back in the early 90s. And what a huge, imposing, intimidating figure. And especially sitting front row when he came by, nearly fell backwards over my chair. I was that kind of in awe of the guy. But I mean, obviously you started off as a wrestling fan, Lee. Were you kind of in awe of any of the guys that you were working around, or maybe starstruck by any of the guys that you maybe grew up watching and then eventually had to work with? Were you in awe or starstruck by any of these larger than life names?
It was just an honor to be in the same. And people would say that now, wouldn't they? If you'd watched the television or you've gone to see the shows, and eventually, if you were a young lad, managed to wrestle someone you followed, that will be a big joy for you. For me, it was to be able to work with, to referee, or to MC some of those great names that I'd grown up with. I think the thing to do is not to be too in awe of them, otherwise you'd munk it all up. So you had a job to do as an announcer, and the best thing you could possibly do is give them the best introduction that you possibly can, and they would be happy with. But they had a job to do, and they got on with it, and entertaining the crowd. They weren't too bothered about me. I'd say I never got in the way. I think that's one of the reasons I've managed to survive so long. And you can ask people like James Mason or Joel Redmond or whatever, is that I've never got too involved with the politics or the arguments or the fallouts or any of that kind of stuff. I just tend to get on with it and just do it.
Absolutely. And tell us about the fans back in the what I'm going to call is the golden era of British professional wrestling, because a lot of people over romanticize British wrestling from the 70s and the 80s, and these packed halls and the loud kind of enthusiastic fans. But what was your experience, especially being so close to the action, being at ringside as an MC or occasionally in the ring as a referee? What was your experience of the fans 38 to 40 years ago, when they were packing out the halls around the UK?
Most of the fans were okay, and you get the lively ones. And I think the big change now is that there's a lot more youngsters that come to the wrestling. So you got your teenagers and younger. Back then you had a real family mix, and a lot of the older people used to enjoy wrestling, but they would appreciate it. But occasionally at some venues they would get very excited. We mentioned earlier, and you ask anyone who's been around a long time, what was the most dodgy venue, and a lot would say Norwich, so the Cornish Agricultural Hall. It was on a Saturday night, and that was quite a dangerous place. They got to the stage where they used to have security there to protect the wrestlers, which was like unheard of. That could go off and get a bit lively, and you can't show fear, especially if you're especially refereeing. I remember once I was refereeing and I disqualified someone. The crowd thought I shouldn't have disqualified, so they're after my blood now, and the match has ended and the wrestlers are making their way back to the ring. So I'm left alone in the ring. I've got to get out at some stage. And it's only me, so I think, well, am I going to get out? So you hope they're going to calm down. So you pretend to check a corner pad and make sure the ropes are okay. You're just ad-libbing, waiting for a chance to think, I'll go now. But I'll always remember, and bless him, because everyone had just got back to the dress, they weren't bothered. But Crusher Mason, Lindsay Mason's dad, who would wrestle as the Mighty Chain, with a big, stocky guy, solid guy, but very agile for such a big fella. He suddenly realized the referee's still in there, isn't it? So he turned round, walked back, and he was a villain then as well. He'd walked back and he just gave me a look, which basically said, he just gave me a look, which basically said, okay, come out now. So I sort of came out, dropped out. He pretended to argue with me because I was disqualified and all that. But what he was doing is he was making his way back to the dressing room. He was protecting me to get out of this melee that could be possibly going off at any minute now. So he just needed a look, but we could read each other, and he went, jump down now. So, and then, we got back to the dressing room safely. But I would have been well, killed probably if that. But so Norwich was one. Yeah.
You might still have been in the ring now, Lee, if it weren't for him.
I might still have been, We were at Walthamstow one night, and we had someone jump in the ring during a Kendo Nagasaki match, which you must never do.
No.
He was quickly dispatched straight out the other end, and again, I was refereeing that. And I always remember about 5 minutes later, I'm carrying on refereeing, and all of a sudden, a couple of police officers arrive at ringside. And again, it was John Harris that was emceeing, and I couldn't quite hear him refereeing in the ring. But I could just hear John suddenly say, well, I can't stop the match midway through. We have to wait till afterwards. So I thought, oh, God, we've got to go and see the police now. And we did. The police station was right next door. And so we all had to go to the police station and give them a statement afterwards about this guy that jumped in the ring.
How fascinating.
Apparently he jumped in the ring because he didn't like what Nagasaki stood for. He thought it was cultish and devil worshipping, and he didn't like that. So, but Nagasaki just got rid of him. But
I thought it was bad enough. I thought it was bad enough with the old women with the walking sticks and the handbags. But don't get in the ring and kind of confront Kendo Nagasaki. That's the last thing you want to do. But I mean, around that time period, we mentioned it briefly a moment ago, but World of Sport, I think, ended in '88, didn't it? And I think there was the British scene was almost overtaken by the American product in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think where you had the British boom period in the early to mid 80s, I think the UK was experiencing another boom period, and that was WWF coming over in the late 80s, early 90s. And I remember it coming over to the Royal Albert Hall in 91. And of course, you had SummerSlam in 92 at Wembley Stadium, and I was at that. But was there a noticeable difference in the business, a noticeable drop-off in the business, the UK wrestling scene, because of the American product almost taking over?
It did, for a while we promoted it still as come and see the stars that you now no longer can see on TV. So that worked for about a year. That's when we did also, again, it was Brian being a very good businessman, because we couldn't see the stars on TV. Brian had an idea to, okay, well, we'll do a video then. We'll make a video of it, which we did at Croydon, that was available in the shop. So this is like the TV show you can't see on TV with all your stars that you can buy as a video. Following on from that, when it did start to go down a little bit, because the beauty of having it on the telly is that you could do storylines. You could have a storyline of, I don't know, Mick McManus versus Jackie Pallo, if you want to go back that far, and then bring it to the halls. The return match, the big battle, Pallo versus McManus. Without the TV to do that, you were still trading on the memories, if you like, for a few years.
Yeah.
But then Brian had an idea, because Brian did, and for a while then we would do American tribute shows. So we'd still have the stars that we had, but we would then bill as, come and see Mankind versus Kane, all very similar,
Or the Undertaker and the Legion of Doom. I think they were doing the rounds.
That's right.
The
Yeah,
British
Legend
version.
became the Legion of Doom.
The Legend of Doom. Sorry, yeah, the Legend of Doom.
Johnny South and the big shoulder pads and all that. So
That's right.
we ran with that for a while, and we had an Undertaker. So Brian had that, and then it did go a bit quiet, but eventually it seemed to kick back a bit. It went peaks and troughs, but yeah, those late 80s, early 90s were interesting times, but worrying times, especially if you are, you got to the stage where All Star they got the slice of the TV and all the names and all that, and then it just went. But then after that, until relatively recently, Brian would bring over some of the genuine stars. So stars from the Attitude Era and other big names, that because sometimes I mean again, I hadn't followed it that closely, so I'd be working with these guys that were big, but I didn't know who they were necessarily until I worked with them, and then I found out about them and thought, oh yes, we had the Earthquake, John Tenter. He was a lovely guy. Yokozuna, Batu. I've got Gangrel comes over quite a lot.
Right. Gangrel was a regular, wasn't he? Still is, I believe, coming over to the UK. Sure.
Yeah. So we did have some of the big stars coming over as well. So that was great.
Absolutely. And let me ask you, I mean, you had the best seat in the house, certainly as a ring announcer. What are some of your memorable matches or moments that you'll fondly remember, certainly from them golden years then, Lee?
I think from the golden era, any matches that involved Marty Jones and Mark Rocco, I think would be up there. Yes, you had Johnny Saint, who was one of the classiest wrestlers you could get. A wrestler I think it was still underrated from that era, because you talk about great lightweight stars and then you think of Johnny Saint and then you think of Steve Gray. I like watching Vic Faulkner. He was brilliant because he had the skill of someone like Johnny Saint to get out all his complex hold, but there was great comedic value with him as well. So I think someone like Vic Faulkner was very underrated. But I think if you're looking for matches that were ahead of their time, I think you put Mark Rocco with Marty Jones in that sort of era. They were always brilliant matches to watch.
Absolutely. And speaking about matches that are ahead of their time, Lee, let's talk about jackets that are ahead of their time, and some of your incredible jackets that you would wear. You're working for All Star back in the 80s, and very colourful, very shiny. Tell us about the jackets, some of the jackets that you wore on TV and at the shows up and down the country, because they're just as memorable as anything else.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, the white one that I started with, that was mine, and I had that in Butlins. So that was all right. And if you remember when we did the TVs back in those days, what they used to do is you do an evening of wrestling, about 6 matches or so, and they used to chop them in half. So
Yes.
you get 1 week, you get 3 matches, and then about 3 or 4 weeks later, you get the other half. So the first one that Brian gave me to do was in Dewsbury in Yorkshire. So I could wear the white one for the first half, and I thought, well, I've got to wear something different in the second half. So I bought this black thing. I hired it from Moss Bros because I only had 1 suit. So I wore that, and then Brian said, well, we're going to give you 1 more TV to do in Bedworth. And I thought, well, okay, if he's giving me more work anyway, and I've got another TV to do, I want to get something that's a little bit different if I'm going to be doing this a bit more, if I'm lucky enough to do that. So I went into London. I went into a specialist tailors. Can't buy them in the shops. And so it was a made to measure thing, and they made it in gold, and it was like a theatrical costumery place in the middle of Covent Garden sort of area, and they made it up. It's all made to measure. you were
Brilliant.
mentioning earlier about, being in the dressing room with these legends. That was the time when I was nervous, when I suddenly, for the first time, with all these big, your Tony Sinclairs and your Finleys, and suddenly walked in with that on. It was par for the course, I suppose, because they wrestled in that era. But I suddenly thought, should I really be doing this in the middle? But it was, the only bit of hate mail I ever got was because of that jacket. We still
No.
don't really know who sent it, but I got a letter saying, well, we're glad wrestling's coming off the TV with people like you getting the ring, making a clown show of it all. So someone didn't like that jacket.
And I wanted something I found utterly fascinating in my research, Lee, and that you also appeared as a guest on a very well known, a very popular TV show in the 80s called What's My Line, hosted by Angela Rippon. Now I've seen the segment that you were involved in. Where there's a panel of celebrities who would try to identify a person's profession through a series of questions and simple yes or no answers. But that looked like a lot of fun. And like I say, it took the celebrities several kind of attempts to try to figure out exactly what your profession was. And of course, it was a wrestling referee is what you were down as during What's My Line. Tell us about how did that opportunity arrive, and tell us about the experience and what it was like. Tell us about the filming as well. It looked like a lot of fun.
It was, yes, it was a lovely day out. I mean, the producer of that was a guy called Maurice Leonard, who also did a lot of the Michael Barrymore stuff. So you can imagine the kind of My Kind of People show that Barrymore did. It was that kind of fun atmosphere. We did that at Teddington Lock at the studio, which used to be the old Thames TV studio. So we went down during the day. We had a little bite to eat and sort of it was genuine too. The celebrities were kept away. They genuinely didn't know what the job was. So yeah, it did take a little bit of guessing, but it was fun to do. They guessed it in the end. Mine was checking the boots, because you had to come on and do a little mime first.
I was trying to figure out what the mime was, and I couldn't quite identify it until you just said.
Yeah, that's what. Yes, because checking the boots before we start. Yep, you're okay. You can go ahead, but yeah, you can still find it somewhere. Maybe I'll post it back on my Facebook page soon, so you can have a look if you want. But that was it was a lot of fun. I don't know. I think, did I apply? Did they ask me? I can't remember how I did it. But I know they were. I think they probably were looking for unusual professions for the new series, and I think I probably wrote in and said, "Here's one," and they quite liked it. So yeah, we went down and did it.
Oh, very entertaining. It is. I did see it on your Facebook actually. So, but repost it because it's definitely worth a watch for sure. And you're also the host and the commentator on what I believe is the very first wrestling VHS cassette available in the UK, and it's the Mick McManus World of Wrestling, and you played the role of the commentator. So that's quite an honour to have been involved or be part of the very first VHS wrestling tape available in the UK.
That's right. Yes, that's lovely, isn't it? Because records can be, you can be the fastest, the tallest, or whatever. That someone else will come and take that from you, but they never can take a first, can they? So again, that was Brian Dixon's and his brainwave. Just after the television was finishing, he thought, well, let's put out a video then of people that people can buy it and still see Great British Wrestling, because it was done by the TV people. So it was produced was a guy called Mike Archer, who did the last number of years on the ITV 4 o'clock and 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock shows from there. So Brian got together with him to do another TV show. I don't know why they didn't ask Kent Walton to do that, because it would have been a good move to say, well, here's an extra one with Kent Walton. I don't know why Kent didn't or wasn't asked or whatever. But again, Brian asked me if I do it. There's a big show from Croydon, and again, that's on YouTube. The sound's a bit dodgy on it, but you can see it on YouTube. Some great matches, and there's a story behind that as well, because I cost them a lot of money on that thing. We had it all planned. It was at the Fairfield Hall in Croydon, and the plan was Mick McManus, Mick and I were going to be doing the commentary at ringside like he would, And about 4 days beforehand, I got this terrible throat infection, and I couldn't speak. And it got worse. The throat just kind of closed up. I couldn't eat. I could hardly drink. I was in quite a bad way. So I drove down there. And if you watch the video, you see I don't actually speak at all. We do little shots in the commentary box, and it's supposed to be a bit of two-way going on between Mick and myself.
Yeah.
But I couldn't speak, so I just nod. And then I got back in the car, drove back home, and sort of crawled back into bed, and recovered about a week later. So I didn't see the show. I wasn't there. I was only there for little cutaway scenes, and we had to go down to a recording studio in Shepherd's Bush about a month later and do it then. So it was supposed to be live, and we do it as live. And I am reacting for the first time because I didn't see it on the night. I wasn't there. So all the reactions are all genuine, but it's done as live, but I wasn't live at all. It was a month later we did that, all because my throat had gone and I couldn't speak on the night. So,
How fascinating. How fascinating. What an incredible story. And as I alluded to at the very top of this interview, now you hosted the British wrestling reunion for many years, but I believe it was a couple of years ago in 2021 you were actually inducted into the British Wrestlers Reunion Hall of Fame 2021 class, which and as I said at the very, very top, you are definitely worthy of being called a legend and being a part of my Legends Masterclass series, because you are, of course, a Hall of Famer. So tell us about that. That must have been a hell of a thrill for you.
It was, yeah, and it was totally unexpected. I didn't know about that. I was lucky enough to be awarded one a few years before then for services to wrestling, which was really nice. Thank you. But yeah, on that night, a Hall of Fame, because the names that were inducted into the Hall of Fame before then, it really is a who's who of British wrestling, and it was a big honor anyway, but a special honor because at the time there was only one other non-wrestler who'd ever been inducted into the Hall of Fame, and that was Kent Walton, the commentator from Mind TV. So it was Kent Walton and me were the only two at the time non-wrestlers to be given that award. So that was a big honor. It's got pride of place on my wall at home, that one. That's very nice.
Absolutely. Many congratulations. Now, we've spoken about him a few times already during the course of this interview, but let's talk a little bit more about Brian Dixon, because ultimately he was the man responsible for giving you an opportunity in the British wrestling business, and 38 years later, like I say, we are here talking about your career, thanks in no small terms to Brian Dixon. And obviously we had the recent passing of the great man, the legendary British promoter Brian Dixon, a few months ago now in May. Recently had his funeral. You were there, but what does the passing of Brian, somebody that you worked with for so long and knew for so many years, and a man that gave you so many opportunities, what does the passing of Brian mean to you, and what will you remember about Brian?
Yeah, it's I think James Mason said on your podcast with him a few months ago, it is a case of when you've worked with someone for so long. James said, if you cut me, I bleed all-star. And that's how I feel as well. Even when I work for other promoters, and it's nice when the phone rings, it's still Lee Bamber of All Star Promotions working for someone else that particular night. Yeah, Brian, we mentioned a few times how he was a great opportunity. He'd see an idea, he'd try an idea. It wouldn't always work, but he had that vision, and he brought me into the business. To say he gave me the name Lee Bamber. We will miss him. When I put on Facebook when he passed on, the nearest I can get to trying to explain it to people is that if you remember, a couple of years ago when the Queen passed on, for a while the country was a bit, well, we've always known the Queen. There's never been a time when the Queen wasn't there. It feels a bit strange. And in the world of wrestling, it was like that with when Brian wasn't there. He cut back due to ill health a little bit, but he was still keen, still promoting, even from home, just a couple of months before he died, because his grandson Joseph was basically running the shows for him then. But we were at Epsom. My phone rang about 15 minutes before the show started, and it was Brian on the phone saying, is everyone there? I've got a birthday to read out. Do it after match number 2, and make sure you plug next show and all. Yes, Brian. And that was just before he passed on. So we'll always be grateful to him, and I think British wrestling will always be grateful to him. I know Joel Redmond's got a fantastic training school down in Salisbury, and he's got some posters on the wall. And right at Pride of Place, there's this big picture of Brian Dixon, and Joel says if any of the trainees say, "Who is that guy?" and he hopes they do, because then he can explain what Brian meant to everyone in wrestling throughout the years. So yeah, we will miss him, but his influence, especially on people that have been around in the business for a while, will carry on for their career.
Absolutely. And but my final question to you, Lee, is like I say, 38 years in the wrestling business, many more to come. But what's been maybe the top 1 or 2 proudest moments of your illustrious and legendary career so far?
So many. Obviously the first job, the first proper show that I did for All Star, that will be memorable. Mentioned earlier with the Knight family, give me the honor of presenting the show at their Fightmare at Carrow Road, Norwich City's ground. That was a big one. Memorable. I had wrestling at my wedding. Most people have a disco or something like that. I had a wrestling show.
Oh, tell us about that. We got to hear.
Which the crowd, obviously the venue had never had wrestling before. So after we reassured them that their floor would be all right, we put carpet down for the ring. Yeah, we had two matches. There's the dog. We had 2 matches.
Yeah,
we had,
sorry about that.
we had Doug Williams. Doug was at my wedding, so that was great fun. Doug Williams against Flash Barker in one match, and then what was going to, because a lot of people may not have seen wrestling before, at least not live, so we had to lighten it a bit. So what better combination than Steve Gray against Mal Sanders in a custard pie match? That was the loser gets a custard pie in the mush, and I refereed it. And what was really lovely is that the ring was nicely turned out anyway, and they put this big bouquet of flowers in the corner posts with the flowers like draping across from the corner. So it actually looked, because you're thinking, is a wrestling ring going to look good at a wedding reception? But it did. It looked really lovely. So yeah, but thanks to Peter Jane, the team, for that one. But there are photos around of that as well. So a wrestling match at a wedding. But, yeah.
Well, funny you should mention Mel, because I've got Mel Sanders coming on as my 6th guest for episode 6 of the Legends Masterclass in a couple of months' time. So make sure that you kind of catch that one. But Lee Bamber, legendary ring announcer and referee, it's been wonderful speaking to you on episode 5 of the Legends Masterclass. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for the wonderful stories.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you, John. Thank you.